African economy should not rely on external partners anymore. We need to bet on ourselves. So I think the key message is that, by the year 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world are going to be from Africa. If we don't sort out our problems, Africa's problems are going to become the world's problems. But then that's also creating a real opportunity to do well and to do good simultaneously. And I think that's what makes it quite exciting.
Today I'm joined by Ronak Gopaldas. He's a political economist and the director at Signal Risk. Thank you very much for joining me on Markets Magnified, Ronak. And he's here to talk things all Africa. And I know it's difficult and it's tricky sometimes to talk about all things Africa because it is a large continent and you have these pockets with the unique characteristics. So apologies if I do generalize at some point about the African continent. But when you look at and you think about the global structure and how it's set up, it's all often the superpowers that are really the main characters at the table. And Africa's always been fighting for its spot, fighting for its voice to be heard at this table. But we know these dynamics have been shifting, right? The global structures, there's been underlying currents that's changing the global dynamics. Where does this leave Africa? Where do we fit in as a continent in these changing dynamics?
Hi, Ilze. Great to be with you, and great question. I think, like you said, the global context is important, and I think we've seen some pretty fundamental changes since 2020. COVID and the Ukraine war really exposed the global governance and financial fissures between the global north and south, and it's fundamentally reshaped the global political economy. We can see that the international rules-based order is being challenged, and so is the global financial architecture. And there are a few reasons for this, right? So, I mean, if you look at both the pull and the push factors, the first thing is vaccine apartheid and the global north's behavior during the pandemic. When you overlay that with a very binary framing around the Ukraine war, which alienated countries that didn't want to pick a side, that created a trust deficit. And the sense amongst countries in the global south is that Western countries view their problems as global, but the rest of the world's problems as regional problems. And that's really created this West versus the rest dynamic. And then, of course, we can't underestimate the impact of the Trump presidency and what that did in terms of a confidence consequence to multilateral institutions. So that's given rise to the global south, which we know is not a geographic term, but a geopolitical one. And it's basically a collective of countries pushing for a fairer global financial and political architecture, which reflects current global realities. So we know, for example, that the UN Security Council was created at a time when most African countries were still under colonial rule. Only last year, the G20 expanded to include the AU. So this is something that obviously resonates with African countries who feel like they've really gotten a raw deal. And again, they felt that they received travel bans which weren't rooted in science. They didn't get vaccines. They were prevented from manufacturing their own ones. They were disproportionately affected by the food and fuel shocks from the Ukraine war. When the dollar strengthened and there were high interest rates in the US and Europe, that spiked their cost of funding and impacted their currencies. And now they're being asked to remedy a problem, the climate crisis, that they didn't create. So this has really fed into the narrative that African countries are trying to fight these external factors with one hand tied behind their back. If you look at the fact that countries like Zambia waited a couple of years for debt relief, but Silicon Valley Bank was saved in 3 days, this has created a real sense of resentment. And we know that it's been a challenging environment on the continent. We've seen 3 debt defaults: Ethiopia, Zambia, and Ghana. Politically, we've seen a number of coups across the continent. So the sentiment towards the continent is a lot more sober now. And I think we're at an inflection point, to be honest, where unless something dramatically changes, we are going to be a laggard continent. But this, I think, is where the opportunity is, because our challenges are our opportunities and our risks are our rewards.
We don't, like I say, we don't really necessarily have this main role, and our problems are regional problems, but yet we know because of Africa's mineral wealth, there's always been this jockeying for power and influence on the continent. These superpowers all want to take the lead. and it also stems, of course, from the young population that the continent has, the growing population, which translates to consumers and labor force. But there has been a change of sentiment and influence. We saw France being kicked out of the Francophone countries.
Mm.
We know that there's been an increase in Russian influence through Wagner. China's always been there through loans and investment, and a definite decline or definite increase or rise of anti-Western sentiment. So we have this, it's almost like a pack of horses racing for influence on the continent. How has this changed? Who's leading the pack, and where is this going?
So you've got your established kind of investors and powers who've been on the continent for a long time. So that's your European investors, the US, which has arguably been a global superpower through the Washington Consensus, and China, which has adopted a cash for infrastructure, cash for resources type of model. And these have been the three dominant players, I would say. But I think what we're seeing now is a wave of emerging players who are also courting Africa. And I think any global power or aspiring global power is realizing that for strategic global dominance, Africa is simply too big to ignore. And without Africa on side, they're really going to struggle to become a global power. And so what we're seeing is that global powers are competing in offering a vision and a value set for the future. And we see this across vaccine diplomacy, across engagement around technology, like you mentioned, kind of critical minerals and resources, political and financial systems as well. So we're in a game of kind of geopolitical chess, which is really being played across four dimensions. I would say muscle, memory, messaging, and medium of communication. So the risk, of course, is that this creates a Cold War 2.0 type of situation. We know we've been here in the past before, and this can lead to exploitation. But I think there's a real opportunity from an African perspective over here. Instead of being piggy in the middle and suffering the same fate as we did during the Cold War, we can be kingmaker. And I think here there's an opportunity to exercise strategic diplomacy, to leverage our collective bargaining power, and extract a little bit of value from each party because they each offer something compelling. And I think the trick here is to be pragmatic rather than ideological. And we see certain countries do this really well, Kenya, Egypt, for example. And by doing so, by extracting a little bit from each party and each power, we can really extract investment and strategic value, which will allow us to grow our economies on our terms rather than kind of simply being dictated to.
So this could present a very good opportunity for African markets, especially though there was a string of new debt issuance that we saw, especially in Southern Africa for the first time in a very long time. I mean, these countries can really use this to access the required FDI, to kickstart their economies, to really focus on the development that needs to happen, especially in the wake, like you mentioned, of the pandemic. We know the fiscal situation ain't great. We know the monetary environment is very tight at the moment. Debt is expensive. So this jockeying, if they play their cards right, I mean, you can really make a buck here.
Absolutely, and like you mentioned, the global context, for financing for African sovereigns is difficult. We know that global monetary policy is no longer as supportive as it has been in the past. We're seeing constant geopolitical and trade tensions and disruptions. A lot of our key trading partners have been battling internal issues. So the landscape is complicated. And you just need to kind of look to the way China has shifted its approach to the African continent. We know that China has been a big investor and a big trade partner for a long time on the continent. But there have been subtle shifts in the wake of the pandemic. We know that the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, the flagship investment drive for Beijing, has tapered off since its peak in 2016. There's less direct finance and more trade credit, and it's effectively becoming smaller and greener. Secondly, we also see a shift in the nature of Chinese investment away from state projects, instead focused on trade and private sector investment. And we're seeing this real pivot from infrastructure to industrialization and from extraction to investment. And then the third thing, of course, is China is trying to offer a compelling financial and political architecture which reflects its worldview, in contrast to what we've seen via the Washington Consensus. So this is giving rise to things like the BRICS, the New Development Bank, the GCI, the GDI, the GSI. So this is driven by a lot of factors. The domestic priorities shifting in China, as well as the fact that a lot of African countries are now indebted. So we're seeing a recalibration in this relationship, which, like you said, is opening up pathways for new entrants. And we've seen a big rise in Gulf activity on the continent in the last decade. They're now the fourth largest investor in Africa. We're seeing a massive push recently in terms of food security, energy security, infrastructure via ports. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and the hope from many African sovereigns is that this gap is going to be filled by the likes of Gulf states. In addition to that, we have seen a lot of problems in terms of the funding landscape, but there are also opportunities in terms of the net zero drive in industrial economies. So that's creating a new wave of opportunities to really tap into the green hydrogen opportunity set, renewables, and that's potentially a silver lining, which African sovereigns can leverage as a result of these changing geopolitical and trade dynamics.
We know, obviously, a lot of Africa's financial cues come from global current affairs. We're a bit like a flag in the wind. Sometimes they just have to go with it. And one of the most prominent ones is the situation playing out in the Middle East. There's no reason to believe that it could expand, but, anything is possible, I suppose, in this climate. If it does expand, if the conflict grows larger in the Middle East, what are some of the possible significant impacts that could affect the continent?
Cool. So let's look at the risk scenario and the potential for contagion. I think the first area we need to look at is financial markets. So we know that in times of global uncertainty and risk aversion, we see a strengthening of the US dollar. So that's obviously got ripple effects for African sovereigns in terms of their bond deals, their cost of funding, their currency. So if there's a geopolitical risk premium across financial markets, there's definitely going to be an impact for African sovereigns. And we've seen this play out over and over again. In 2020, it was the COVID shock, it was the commodity shock, and it was the cost of funding shock. So we know that this has got significant implications. And as you've mentioned, it's been better part of 2 years since African sovereigns have come to markets for new issuances. So would be another setback. Then, if there's an inflationary impact and there's potentially a delay in the Fed's normalization path, I think that's another the risk factor that we need to watch quite closely. Again, it's in a very tight financing environment already, where the hope has been that softer market conditions will allow for greater issuance or more issuance from African sovereigns. Then I think that's another factor to watch. And then, of course, we're looking at commodity prices. So I think at face value, for commodity producers, if we see a rally in the gold price, which is what happens in times of uncertainty and when there's a flight to safety, it will be good for countries like South Africa and Tanzania. In addition, we're likely to see a spike in oil prices, so good for your oil producers on the continent. But then there's second and third round effects, which play out in energy markets, in shipping routes, and in supply chains. And already we've got issues in the Black Sea and the Red Sea. So if there's a sustained problem in the Strait of Hormuz, I think that's going to have ripple effects on the global economy. It's going to affect demand, obviously. It's going to affect global supply, and it's a critical choke point. So the skill will be for African sovereigns to try and navigate this kind of energy geopolitics. And this is happening in a context where the policy war chests are extremely thin, because it's been kind of policymakers have been trying to deal with the fallout from the pandemic and the wars. And then, of course, we've got a lot of elections on the continent this year. So your ability to navigate this as an African policymaker is constrained, and you'd be hoping that there's no escalation.
When you speak like that, it makes me realize we're facing a lot. it's a lot going on and a lot to consider. But if we could have a crystal ball into the future, where do you think, you mentioned hydrogen, you mentioned renewable energy, which is major industries and could be really beneficial to Africa and its mineral wealth. Where do you think the developmental focal points will be for Africa going forward?
Yeah, so I think it's just that it's energy geopolitics and climate geopolitics. That's the critical area to watch. As we know, the world is trying to shift towards a greener future. Global investment in oil is falling, and demand for metals such as cobalt, lithium, copper, coltan, which are abundant on the continent, is rising. So that's created a new wave of geopolitical competition. And there's an optimistic view and there's a pessimistic view around how that will play out. So um, the risks, of course, are that we've been here before, that we're going to get another resource curse, and that there's going to be resource nationalism. Because this is an industry still in its infancy, we're not sure how this is going to play out in the current political environment. Then, of course, the risk of exploitation. I kind of alluded to climate colonialism, where big global powers are extractive but don't do much for local economies, and Africa kind of again ships off its mineral wealth without any real beneficiation. Of course, environmental risks are there, and the issues of greenwashing and green wishing, where again, the opportunity is squandered. But at the same time, renewed interest in Africa in the wake of Russian sanctions, this push towards net zero can potentially create investment, jobs, can lead to friendshoring and the development of local supply chains. And so it really could be a big boost to the continent's economic development. So, I think we're at a very critical juncture, and there's a lot of critical interest and geopolitical competition at the moment. So I think that's the one area that I think is going to be quite instructive if we're going to look at the continent's development. But I think there are a few lessons that we can also take from the past few years. I think it's quite clear that African economy should not rely on external partners anymore. We need to bet on ourselves, because the events of the last few years, a lot of those that I've alluded to, with the kind of almost quite discriminatory policies that we've seen, mean that we need to kind of look internally for solutions. And I think critical to that is integration. We know that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is in motion. It has been quite slow, but I think trading amongst ourselves is very important. Intra-Africa trade is less than 20%. And I think, looking inwards and reducing the friction around trade creates larger market sizes, creates more prosperity, and I think is something that we really do need to focus on. I think innovation, we know that innovation in Africa is driven by necessity, and especially in the blue and green economies, I think there's huge scope to integrate technology and digital innovation into our development. And then, of course, we're not industrialized, and we need hard, soft, and digital infrastructure to do that. So I think the key message is that by the year 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world are going to be from Africa. If we don't sort out our problems, Africa's problems are going to become the world's problems. But then that's also creating a real opportunity to do well and to do good simultaneously. And I think that's what makes it quite exciting.
Ronak, so we know the US election is quite a tight race. A lot of the Harvard polls have Trump ahead of Biden coming for the November election happening there. It's one thing for me when Trump was president during his time. And he took a very nonchalant stance towards Africa, very don't care. But the world has changed a lot since then. Again, we see these countries fighting for more influence in Africa for various obvious reasons. The dynamics have completely changed from his last presidency. If he manages to get back into the White House, can we expect more of the less from Trump for Africa, or do we think that he might start playing ball a little bit more than what he did the last time?
I mean, Trump by nature is unpredictable, so it's a difficult one to answer. I think we'll see a continuation of the America First policy, make America great again, more insular worldview, railing against multilateralism. But I think there is an element of pragmatism, right? If we know that he's a deal maker and he wants to do deals, so if you're in the American orbit of influence and subscribe to the American worldview and fit in with the security objectives, I think there's potential benefit for countries that play that hand quite well. So I think it's going to be difficult. I think we know that on issues like climate change, we know how he thinks. We know how he thinks around kind of global governance and multilateral systems. So there's going to be collateral damage, and I think how African states position themselves is going to be quite important around what they view their priorities. So we know that commercially, private sector investment is something that's important to him. He did some good stuff under the Prosper Africa initiative, which was his flagship Africa initiative the last time around. So, trying to understand how to navigate that is important. There are obviously going to be question marks around AGOA and whether the US feels it gets benefits around that. And then I think, given the fact that foreign policy tends to get framed around what China is doing and what Russia is doing, that gaze, I think, is going to influence the Trump approach to global affairs. And again, obviously there are considerable risks involved with that, but I think smart and savvy diplomats will be able to kind of find opportunities to exploit and to find the opportunity within the chaos.
So, Ronak, the message is Africa must start betting on itself, and we can move this continent into a place of prominence among the global superpowers. Ronak, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to chatting to you again soon.